grew up in the city of Newburgh, which is where we are right now, and it's full of historic architecture. So now I can tell you it's the largest historic district in New York State. It's 445 acres of historic buildings. But as a child, it was just interesting that every single building was different, and all of the ornate stonework and the woodwork that you saw. And it always brought up questions of what was here before, because what's happened in the city in the past 50 years has changed everything about the city, and it gives you the impression that something's different, so it brings a lot of questions. And I also worked as a tour guide in my teenage years at Washington's headquarters, which is a state historic site, and it's of national significance. It's where George Washington lived the longest during the Revolutionary War. So the experience of being there on the property every day, seeing tourists come from all over the world who valued that location, and then looking around the immediate neighborhood and realizing that it wasn't valued at home, brought up a lot of questions as to why. Why isn't the history known? Why isn't it more of a tourist destination? Why aren't there supporting businesses around it? So if you go somewhere else that is a tourist destination, you're usually going to find other businesses and trinket shops and better transportation to get you to that location. And here it really felt like an island, and I always wondered what that was about. So my interest in history came from understanding a sense of place and how historic preservation, architectural preservation, builds community, and if you don't know the past, you can't make sense of where you are, and that was something that I felt very strongly here in the city of Newburgh.
Now, you took the position exactly a year ago, March of 2014. Also with you today, not to leave out, your assistant Dawn Elliott. And I have a question actually for both of you. What, as historians, what are your goals for Orange County in general? And does preservation, is that all part of it?
Preservation is a huge part of the mission of the county office, and that's really countywide. We have the Seward Homestead, we have Hathorne House, we have buildings throughout the county. Like I said, mentioned Dutch Reformed Church in Newburgh. There's lots of others that I could mention that are fighting for the funds to be able to preserve. So it's a very big part of the work that we do in the office.
And speaking of preservation, one of the controversies that has come up recently and has been over the years is the Paul Rudolph Government Center in Goshen. And as of last Thursday, legislators basically voted down not to override Steve Newhouse's, who's the county executive, his veto, which he made back in February, to not demolish the building. Now, Johanna, what would you say? First of all, what is your position on it? And what would you say to those who did oppose the demolition and wanted to go with the architect firm of Kaufman down in Manhattan and his plan for an artist's colony and to preserve the government center and the Rudolph building? And what he says is half the cost of some of the bids that have come in for demolition.
I think that we need to just go way back and discuss something else, which is that something that Dawn brought up recently, which is that too often history gets distilled into sound bites. So that's what just happened here. You're throwing out a lot of information about what it would cost for different types of plans, or who wanted certain plans to happen. But too much of it, in my opinion, is governed by the political system. So the building, the government center, which was built by Paul Rudolph, it's very important architecturally. It's designated by the World Monument Fund. In 2011, it was one of the 100 most endangered buildings in the world. And it's recognized in academic circles for architecture as something that really showcases Rudolph's vision as an architect. So he was a brutalist architect, and he designed these very large, imposing concrete structures. His primary time was in the 1960s, and it was at a time when they were really getting away from the classical architecture that government buildings were built in the past. So it was striking a new movement in architecture, and that's why it's significant.
Ulster County's office building is a similar example of something that's remarkably different than anything that had been there before.
Mm-hmm. And so the Rudolph building is built in 1967. And it, at the time, was already unpopular because the village of Goshen is a very quaint, colonial, 18th and 19th century style town, and people in its own era saw it as something that was imposing and not didn't fit into the landscape. So now you get into politics. The building was flooded in 2011 and evacuated because of mold issues. It's debated whether or not those mold issues were bad enough that it should have happened that way, but the reality is it did happen that way. It was evacuated. And since that time, so now from 2011 to where we are now, 2015, this narrative has changed over and over again. So parts of the legislature have wanted to push for total restoration. Some have wanted to push for total demolition. And the middle ground is what's winning out now, which is a heavy renovation of the building that's going to change the facade. So you're not going to be seeing Rudolph's building from the outside, vision from the outside, but they're going to maintain a lot of the elements on the interior main entranceway. So you will have a sense of Rudolph once you're inside.
Well, and there is one argument made that with the interior, Rudolph had actually designed it in a way where it made the public actually, brush shoulders with the politicians, and also in a way where the actual chamber itself was made to look like the chamber in London of the House of Commons, and actually would want politicians, if they didn't really want to get into some sticky debates, to actually face each other and let's get on a debate. Now, do you feel that possibly this had to do with some of the politics of not wanting that anymore?
No, I think it's more aesthetic than that, more simplistic and more aesthetic. I think that, if you Google Paul Rudolph on YouTube, you'll find him speaking about the beauty of his work and the purpose of his work. He understood Foley function, so he was thinking of all those things that you're saying when he went into this. He was understanding how people interact in space and what a government center should look like, and he also had a sense of time. So he knew that he didn't want to build the same type of building that was built 100 years or 200 years before it. He wanted it to look like it was part of its time. So the problem is that was lost. That the politicians, the public, and the way Rudolph puts it in some of these YouTube videos, if you will watch them, is the common man. The common man doesn't appreciate all of the layering of meaning that was put into the design of this building. So it's that simple. People drive down the street in Goshen and they say, what is that strange building? It doesn't look like that cute one down the road.
But it also doesn't have to look like that cute one down the road, I think, and sometimes, and I used to struggle with that when I served on my Historic Preservation Commission in New Paltz, where sometimes it felt like, as a Preservation Commission, you don't just want to be anti-change. I mean, styles of architecture are going to change, and so you want to maintain an integrity of what exists, but then I think that this building is in a difficult position because it isn't necessarily going to have the support of the same people who care about 18th or 19th century architecture, even though it probably should. Like Johanna had mentioned earlier, that it's in the awkward phase of where, buildings need to be older than, say, your grandparents' generation for people to really feel like preserving them is valuable. It's old enough to be out of date, and it's not old enough to be incredibly rare. It is rare, I guess, in the fact that it's basically a unique building.
Right. But a good point that can go on top of that is that we were talking about the Dutch Reformed Church in Newburgh, which is another building in Orange County that was designated by the World Monument Fund as endangered, and it was in 1995 that it made the list of the top 100 endangered. And that building was in operation from when it was built in 1835 to 1967. So there's a little bit of poetic overlap there, in the sense that that building was in use as a public building, closes in 1967, and then that's exactly when the Rudolph building is built. So you can get a sense of how at that time they really thought they were progressing and they were building this new vision. But the Davis building was caught up in the same thing. It at that time it wasn't old enough to be considered that important. It was an era where they wanted to tear everything down. It was urban renewal, and luckily it survived long enough to be in the state that it's in now, which is that it's still standing, but it's really on there's little hope now. The coffered roof has collapsed. The cornerstone areas are all leaking and flooding. So we're dealing with two really separate issues here. We're dealing with the Paul Rudolph building, which is being destroyed because of progress and because of trying to make a new use for the structure. And then we're dealing with the legacy of what happens when people do that, which is what happened to the church. It became a playhouse and a couple of other functions afterwards, but it was never loved or cared for, and it never got the reinvestment that it needed to make it to today's era. So it's barely surviving because of this period of neglect, whereas the Rudolph building is barely surviving because of the feelings that people have for it. It's the same story in different cycles, and we're in two different places with each building.
You know, that river behind you there is pretty historic. Is it your hope that, you know, because the Hudson River Valley has the history that it does, would it be your hope to kind of integrate with all the other local historians, say from Dutchess County, from Westchester, from Ulster, Putnam, and all, you know, and bring them all together with Orange and actually do some really big things for the Hudson Valley itself?
Yeah, definitely, and that's something that's already underway. So you asked us earlier about what is the purpose of the county office or any municipal historian or any public historian. And I think it is twofold, and both of them fit into that idea of the Hudson being of this sort of connector, rather than the barrier that unfortunately some people might see it as. And that is that we have as a public historian, you have an obligation for the professional development side of it, which is that we want to bring in young people. We want to show them how to make a career in history. That if you go to school and you study history, that doesn't mean you have to teach in a classroom somewhere. It can mean a lot of things. It can mean working in a museum. It can mean working for the government. It can mean working in the private sector as well when you get into tourism and those sorts of aspects. And then there's also the element on the flip side of dealing with people who are much older, who have been doing history for many, many years.
Those are the two age extremes that we have with our volunteers. We have teenagers, most of whom don't care that much about history, so then I always hope that their experience at the museum will bring them to care about history. And then we have the older volunteers who are extremely passionate about it, and it's difficult, not with my volunteers specifically, because I think that they're an extremely welcoming, helpful group of people who bring their passion to all the visitors that they talk to. But I think that there is a resistance in the history world sometimes to the change that younger people bring when they come in, and that's a difficult personality thing to navigate, because that kind of
I often wonder, though, if it's something that happens in every generation, that every time a new cycle of people come in and they get excited, and I know we did it when we came into the historic sites when we were young, and want to do things at a faster pace and want to change things. Does that just happen every generation, or is it really different now because of the technological changes? So we grew up in an era where we saw the transition from the file cabinet to the digital archive. We saw the change from the tour guide who was paid full time to do that job by the government, had a great job, a great pension and everything, to the curator or the tour guide who is cobbling together lots of part-time jobs, and also who's not being given that kind of support, and they're being asked to digitize everything, make everything automated, where you go into a museum and you push the button to hear something, or so we've seen that in our lifetimes. That's a major change.
Mm-hmm.
So I often wonder if that friction always exists, or if it exists now, and if it's more important now to address it.
And the technological change, I think that's a huge reason why you don't necessarily have younger people coming in, because they haven't heard about special events, they aren't aware of them. I mean, when you get these museums that are still doing paper newsletters that you have to pay money for, but they don't have, say, an active Facebook page. And that's kind of silly, because a lot of people in my generation don't really have the money to pay multiple historical societies a $25 a year membership in order to find out what they're doing.
But they'd gladly volunteer if they knew the help was needed.
Yeah.
I mean, there's other ways that those people can come in and be a participating member. And I think that's exactly right. I think a lot of things are getting lost, so we're communicating on these two different planes, and they're not always mixing. And it's our generation that has that responsibility of trying to bring that together. So how do you take the expertise and the knowledge of people who have worked in the archives and seen every piece of paper as it's come through, which you can't replicate with somebody young who's just starting out. It takes a long time to build that kind of a knowledge base. And also they have a sense that everything is a soundbite. Everything is, how do I Instagram this, or how do I capture some moment? So it's more of a novelty. They're seeking the novelty. I think that's a cultural change that's happened. That
yeah, sometimes it can actually be extremely heartbreaking for me in a way as a museum professional, where when people, it's certainly not everyone, because we get people that come and ask us questions and are wonderful, but it's really troubling how many people come to the museum and they just click, and they go through and they don't listen, they don't read the signs, they just Instagram it. You know, and I talked to one group of parents with a bunch of kids, and they breezed in through this building that really you could spend an hour in less than 3 minutes. And I said, well, you know, please come back. I'll be here until 2 o'clock. You've got another 3 hours to come back at any point and ask me questions. And she interrupted me and said, no, she said, I got enough pictures already. And it was, I was like, oh man.
But you have to appreciate that, because that's being blasted out to all of her followers, and somebody else sees it and they want to come and experience
There's some value to that,
right.
yeah. And, I mean, and of course we exist so that people can look at the objects in some ways, of course, but ideally it would be nice if they got something more out of that experience.
So now that's only one half of your question, talking about the connector of the river and how do we work with other groups all over the place. One way is this sort of the social media aspect, where we're supporting each other's events by being aware of them and sharing them with others.
Mm-hmm.
But another way is so that's sort of internal, and the other way is the external, which is the tourism and economic development side of things. So there's a big emphasis right now on how do you create trails, you know, a wine trail, the heritage trails that bring you through the county. How do you showcase history in a way that's an activity for people? So that's a tourism focus for sure, and that you can't create boundaries for that, because if you're traveling from another country, or if you're traveling from the other side of this country, you have no idea what Orange or Dutchess or Ulster County is. You're not thinking.
Right.
You're not thinking in those barriers. You're thinking of the Hudson Valley as a brand. So it's trendy right now. It's popular. You see lots of magazine articles that talk about the Hudson Valley as a destination. Nobody ever says Orange, Dutchess. It isn't split up that way. So we have to work together, because that's what the public sees us as. They want to hop back and forth around the river. They want to kayak on the river. They want to also visit these like rail trails, or these the D&H Canal Trail, or places like West Point or Washington's headquarters that are the more established museum settings. So we have that already happening, and that's a very important focus of the office as well.